Hello, everyone. Uh, I'm Sarah Kernan, one of the co-organizers of this event. It is with great pleasure that the other organizers, Alan and David, and I welcome you to the conference, Food in the Book, 1300 to 1800. While I would have loved to have welcomed and seen everyone in person as we originally planned pre-pandemic, I am excited that presenting this conference online affords us the opportunity to include even more participants and a much larger audience today. So thank you all for coming. I want to reiterate the thank yous that Kathy and Leah enumerated before the public session today. None of this would have been possible without the support of so many Newberry and Folger staff and the enthusiasm of all involved, especially our outstanding lineup of participants. Since I have been most active organizing on the Newberry side of things, I especially want to thank a few people at that institution who have been fielding many emails, namely Chris Fletcher, Becky Fall, and Leah Markey. I'm in awe of the amazing logistical work they have done. And I also think Leah has been present for more planning, meetings, and conversations about this conference than the official organizers have. And she probably deserves some sort of award for not only putting up with us, but helping us craft a really phenomenal conference. So thank you. When I first met Leah 4 years ago, I briefly mentioned that I'd love for the Newberry to have a conference someday on food history. It really was just a mention at that time, but gradually seemed like more of a possibility after Alan, Leah, and I organized an early modern food history workshop in 2018. Following that event, the Center for Renaissance Studies and the Folgers Before Farm to Table initiative began collaborating to plan this conference. It was my thought then, up until today, that while food history, and more specifically food studies based in historical books, broadly defined, has been gaining steam in recent years, the one thing missing, despite increasing publications, more fellowship opportunities, and digital initiatives, has been a large conference to draw all of our scholarship together. I hope that you will be able to see as many sessions as possible throughout the conference to truly get a sense of the breadth of research, and in particular, all the work being done by early career researchers and graduate students. There is a long and hopeful future for this field. Organizing this conference has also revealed certain gaps in research being conducted, and I have no doubt that those topics will arise in specific panels. It is my hope that the conference will invigorate participants in our audience to explore new avenues and methods of research and begin to fill in those voids. So again, welcome and thank you to all of you for being such a great part of such an exciting event. So I'm going to hand things off to David now to say a few words.
I was muted. Now can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much. This conference is such a group effort among the co-organizers you're meeting here, and between the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry and Before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures. And I wanted to just take a moment to talk about that as one of the co-directors about this project, which is a multi-year collaborative research project funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Its mission is threefold: to capture the state of knowledge about food and foodways in the early modern world, to push that knowledge forward through interdisciplinary and collaborative research, as well as through a command of both early modern analog technologies, like the books we're studying, and cutting-edge digital technologies, which allows us to think through, read through, talk through, compute through, and even cook through the deep questions facing the field. And then third, to engage with communities beyond early modern studies and beyond academia in order to use all our knowledge in the service of the most pressing issues facing our food systems today, including systemic and local structures of injustice and inequity, concerns about food insecurity, hunger, and famine, questions about how food shapes cultural and individual identity, and the impacts of growing and consuming food on the global environment. I want to take a moment to introduce verbally the other members of the Before Farm to Table team. All of us are involved in various ways in the conference. So you'll see everyone's smiling faces before too long. And you can see some of the work we're doing on our website at www.folger.edu. My fellow co-directors are Amanda Herbert, Associate Director at the Folger Institute, and Heather Wolf, Curator of Manuscripts at the Folger. Our team also includes 3 astoundingly talented postdoctoral research fellows, Elisa Tersini, Michael Walkton, and the newest member of our team, Neha Vermani. The project is seamlessly coordinated by Justine De Camillis, and it is overseen indefatigably, I should add, by Kathleen Lynch, Director of the Folger Institute, who you met during our public program. I also want to thank the former members of the team who were with us for the first 2 years of the project and who have gone on to even more exciting adventures, if that's possible. Jack Bouchard, who served as one of our postdoctoral research fellows, and Jonathan McDonald, our former project coordinator. In the past 2 years, the project has produced collaborations and conversations with chefs, activists, and food policy experts, with the Folger Theater, the Third Rail Performance Company, the Folger Consort. We have trained high school students, undergraduates, graduate students in early modern foodways. We've hosted conversations with junior and senior scholars from a variety of food-related fields. We've led transcribathons of early modern recipe books, developed reading copies and a searchable database of those books. We've spoken to audiences all the way from specialized international conferences to the general public. We've experimented with early modern recipe recreation and interpretation. We've produced exhibits, symposia, articles, blog posts, and we're really just at the beginning, at least, of building this learning. We're really hoping that the conference, this collaborative conference, will help push all of this forward. There are so many ways in which we have yet to understand how food operates in the world and why it matters. Food is a fundamental life and death phenomenon, but it also cradles all the nuances of culture and experience, pleasure, trauma, power and oppression, metropole and margin. To study this subject is to shoulder a heavy responsibility to discover and communicate about how food has shaped and continues to shape our world in myriad ways. This conference brings together a dazzling and thoughtful group of people to demonstrate the current state of our knowledge about food in and through the book, while moving that knowledge forward through a network of collaborations within and well beyond academia. So thanks again to the Before Farm to Table team, to our colleagues at the Newberry Library who have been so amazingly generous and capable, and to my fellow co-organizers. And I hope that all of you will have the chance to enjoy and participate in the conference over the next 2 weeks. And now it's my pleasure to turn matters over to Alan. Thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Alan Grieco, and speaking last out of the 3, what happens inevitably is that lots of the thanks have already been said, but I would like to add my own without remembering all the people, and there are many, many people that have been involved in all of this. And maybe the only thing that I would add to what has been said, which I fully agree with, is that this conference grew out of a little seed, because I remember sitting with Leah Markey on the top floor of the Newberry 2.5 years ago, which now feels like it was another world because of what has happened, and talking about the possibility of working out some kind of a big conference, because from the very beginning we thought it should be a big one. And then of course she had the great idea of getting in touch with the Folger, and anyway, I won't go through the whole genesis, but it grew and it changed a lot. The one thing that I felt very much that was important and that has come to bear on the way this conference has come together was that, as you probably know, food history maybe took off a little bit earlier in Europe and a little bit later in North America, but North America has literally exploded since the 90s. And but there's been a little bit of a parallel development, and not always enough, maybe not enough exchange between these two. And so this was also, the idea here was also to try to, as much as possible, put together different traditions, different approaches. And as you will see in the lineup, there's a certain amount of either Europeans or people who at least have been working in the European tradition. And so I'm very pleased that this has come together that way, because I think it's important that while the ideas circulate, not just recipes, but also ideas, or maybe recipes for, doing food history. I think I would just end it here, because introductory talks are always relatively uninteresting. And what we're really here for is to hear the panelists who will be taking over now. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you all enjoy what's coming in the next 2 weeks.
Thanks, Alan. So let's move right on into our first session now. I'll be moderating today's roundtable on cookbooks and recipe books. Due to time constraints, I will not be providing introductions for each presenter. So for their bios, please refer to the PDF titled Presenter Bios, now available on the conference program website. Each of our presenters will initially speak for only 5 minutes. However, all of the remaining time will be devoted to discussion and responding to questions from the audience. And audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom right of your screen to submit those to us. Our panelists today are experts in many traditional areas of scholarship in this field, spanning manuscript and print, the late medieval, Renaissance, and early modern periods, as well as both England and the continent. I hope we will have a truly stimulating discussion about cookbooks and recipe books as a result. So first up is Vanessa Asfora-Nadler, and she will be speaking about the rediscovery of Apicius in the Italian Renaissance.
Good afternoon, and first of all, I also would like to thank the Newberry Library and the organizers of this panel and conference, especially Leah Markey, Alan Greco, Sarah Peters-Kernan, and David Goldstein. Thank you all for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Well, a quick search on the internet using Apicius as a keyword reveals how much this name is associated with cooking and gastronomy. Apicius is the name of a renowned restaurant in Paris. Apicius is also the name chosen for a famous gastronomic magazine. And Apicius is as well the name of a culinary training school in Florence. There would be many other examples to give you, but what I wanted to highlight here is that Apicius and the cookbook attributed to him are usually evoked outside and inside the academy as a kind of father of gastronomy. However, frequently, the ideas surrounding the name of Apicius do not correspond to a proper knowledge of the history of the texts associated with it and their context of production, circulation, and consumption. The meaning of Apicius in the past is certainly different from the meaning attributed to it by people in the 21st century. If nowadays, Apicius can be easily positioned next to gastronomy and far from medical subjects, for a long time, this approach was not that obvious. So in my research, what I have been trying to do basically is to put into historical perspective the elements that contributed to the long existence of Apicius' text among us. I established the Middle Ages as my starting point, since the first Apician manuscripts we know of are medieval ones, and the Renaissance as my arrival point, since it's the moment of the production of the largest number of manuscripts. So who or what is Apicius? The cookbook attributed to Apicius is commonly known as the Reconcinaria, it has a rather controversial authorship because any Apicius could ever be confirmed as the proper author of the text. Being so, I have adapted in my work the perspective suggested by Sally Granger and Christoph Grobkar in their 2006 critical edition of Apicius, that is, to consider the text as a result of an anonymous and complex process of collection, of recipe collection that could have started as early as the 2nd century BC and ended by the 4th century AD. The discussion about the origins of the text, however, was never been my research focus. I focus on the medieval Apicius and its rediscovery by Italian humanists in the 15th century. The text tradition consists of 20 manuscripts, 3 of which were copied between the 8th and 9th centuries, 16 in the course of the 15th century, and 1 in the 17th century. While the first printed editions date back to the very end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century. There are also 2 printed editions from the 18th century. There will be many things to tell you about the manuscripts I have studied so far, but I have chosen to finish this very brief talk with few words on the possible ways of consuming Apicius in the 15th century Italy. So firstly, Apicius might have been consumed as an object. Apicius, in this case, Apicius manuscripts would be kept in restricted places, as for example, a studiolo, and it might have functioned as an object of consumption, ostentations, consumption, an object of luxury, rather than a book to be read for its recipes. And secondly, as a text. This happened when readers became interested in their recipes as a vehicle of knowledge. For example, the recipes might begin to be seen as sources for the study of, for example, Greek, the Greek language, or medical issues. This last topic suggests the need to look deeper into what actually surprises us. The fact that Apicius belongs at that time in a category other than cooking. In fact, the research has indicated that since the Middle Ages, there was a shared idea that Apicius could be read or used as a text for the study of materia medica. One other thing the study of Apicius in those periods suggests is the need to think more carefully about the ancient and medieval classification of knowledge and how they are related or not related to modern science. This has important implications in the way cooking and medicine are understood in the past. And I believe the Apicius could be an important example or contributions in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, we have Lino Mioni, and he will be speaking about the introduction of print and its impact on culinary recipe collections.
As we know, movable type printing is introduced in Venice in 1469. Although not exactly new in Venice, the Senate grants Johann von Speyer the exclusive privilege to print on Venetian soil. Being an expensive enterprise, to be successful, printing needed to be supported. His first printing privileges protect the production of printed books, while at the same time it prohibits the sale of books printed elsewhere, which is also kind of an interesting thing. When it comes to the printed culinary recipe collection, the first printed cookbook is printed in Latin. Although not exclusively a collection of culinary recipes, Plato's De Honesta Voluptate Valetudine is the first printed cookbook of the Western civilization that disseminates culinary recipes. We will have 20 editions in Latin between 1475 and 1541. Printed culinary collections in vernacular language will follow pretty easily. I put there the first titles being printed in German, French, and Italian. Now, if we look, I hope this works. If we looking at printed culinary collections in vernacular Italian, there is one title that by far is the most frequently printed. The Opera Nuova Chiamata Pulario, this is the title of the first edition, will have 50 editions between 1516 and the 1700s. Just to put it in context, the second most printed culinary recipe collection, Mrs. Burgos Banchetti, will be republished 20 times. The Opera Nuova Chiamata Epulario repurposes a culinary recipe collection that had already been used in print in the 1470s in Platina's De Honesta Voluptate, a work that has also been already translated into vernacular Italian in 1457. In the hand of Venetian printers and editors, Platina's work in vernacular is not as successful as it is in Latin. The vernacular Italian translation of Platina's will only have 5 editions, all printed in Venice, and the last being printed in 1516. Now, different from Platina's, the Opera Nuova Chiamata, from Platina's work, the Opera Nuova Chiamata Epulario reproduces exclusively the text of Maestro Martino, Libro d'Arte Coquinaria. As my research has shown, the Epulario is the first cookbook being produced as an editorial object. The Epulario is the result of an editorial operation, or better, a series of editorial operations that will ensure its success in a long period of time. Maestro Martino's innovative organization and the combination of it proposes, alternative ingredients are clearly stated, make the recipes of the Libro d'Arte Coquinaria an open canvas more than a strict set of steps to be followed. The type of cooking proposed is devoted not exclusively to the court, but it can be performed at a smaller scale and by ordinary people. I mean, rich ordinary people, of course. This implies that the possible public, the potential audience for such a printed recipe collection is wider, something very important for editors and printers. The features of Maestro Martino's texts are considerably valuable. Moreover, being a substantially smaller book, it requires less a demanding printing enterprise compared to other cookbooks. The strategic choice of the vernacular and the expansion of the reading public are particularly dear to printers such as Niccolò Zoppino, the editor of five of the earliest editions of the Epulario, and we shouldn't forget many other titles in vernacular Italian. I do think that the publishing activity of printers and editors who publish culinary recipe collections deserve to be studied. Knowing who they are, what else they publish, how they relate to each other would offer a better understanding of the audience of the 16th century reading public. Here in this slide, you have just to have an idea of the dimension of the book. The Opera Nuova Chiamata Epulario is clearly the only octavo that is there. The first edition of Epulario has a woodcut illustration that you can see here from the only copy there is of the 1516 edition, which is at the Houghton Library. This same woodcut will be reused over and over again in other editions of the Epulario. And as you can see, the last one that will be used is the 1555 Giovanni Paduano Ayres edition. The analysis, the title of the Epulario also offer interesting points of analysis. The longer title of the 1516 edition is progressively shortened. Details are abandoned, and the Epulario becomes more prominent as a title. In bold, I've kept the text that is kept, and in italics, I put the text that has been added, and underline the thing that has been stripped away. The interesting thing is that, as you can see in the 1596 edition, there's a mention of the Tavola delle Rubriche, the index basically. That is kind of weird that it appears in the title now, because already in the 1516 edition, there was actually a table of an index table. So there's clearly something going on about selling this book, about making it palatable, so to speak, to the public. The analysis, the dedication page also support my claim about the commercial object of printed cookbooks. 2 different texts for the dedication page appear between 1516 and 1521. Dedication with 2 sonnets on your left and a longer dedication letter on your right. From the 1521 edition onwards, the dedication page is left blank. For brevity, I will talk only about the dedication page with the 2 sonnets. The last tercet that I've highlighted there says, and whoever wants to become a perfect cook should buy me, read me, study me, and approve me, and he will welcome my recipes with delight. that should buy me clearly indicate the commercial nature of printed cookbooks.
Thank you, Lino. Let's move on to our next brief presentation. Carolyn Nadeau, she will be speaking about the legacy of the early modern Spanish cookbook.
Thank you so much. And let me just begin by thanking not only Sarah, but also David, Alan, and Leah, and then more broadly, the Newberry and the Folger for organizing this. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the legacy of the early modern Spanish cookbook, first with a little background to contextualize that, then focus on two specific works of the time period, and then move into legacy of one of the cookbooks. So just a little bit of background. Maria del Carmen Simón Palma, the historian, has identified 635 editions of different diet and cuisine manuals between the 15th century and 1700 in Spain. But of those titles, two really stand out and mark the history of early modern cooking manuals. The first is the Book of Cookery, the Llibre de Cook, which was first published in Catalan in 1520 and then translated into Castilian in 1525. This collection of recipes is the first cookbook ever published in Spain and the definitive cookbook throughout the 16th century, an era in which Spain began to define its national and regional gastronomies. The second cookbook, and that's the one I'm going to focus on today, is Francisco Martínez Montiño's Arte de Cocina, Pastelería, Bizcochería, and Conservería from 1611. This cookbook contains 506 recipes and was published 28 times throughout Spain, 10 in the 17th century, 13 in the 18th century, another 5 in the 19th century, and then in the late 19th century, 3 facsimiles in the 80s and 90s, and even now in the 21st century, additional 3 facsimiles were published. So let's just take a quick look to get a sense of the order of this. You can see by its title, the Art of Cooking, and I've kind of put in red these different sections where the cooking kind of pops out. He starts with poultry, cream-based meats, religious recipes for full and partial abstinence, sauces and vinegars and other savory things sprinkled throughout other parts of the recipe book. In terms of pie making, we have 2 significant sections here. Both contain savory and sweet pies. And then for the pastry section and other baked goods, you'll see these sections later on in the book. And then he kind of finishes off with the preserves of fruit and vegetables. There's 2 or 3 recipes for pickling and jellies. So that gives you a sense. But what I really want to concentrate today is the legacy of Martínez Montiño. And so I'm going to provide you all with 3 examples. When I think of the term legacy, I think of a gift, right? A gift that's handed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. And so we see that gift of Martínez Montiño first manifested in the number of editions that are reproduced between his own lifetime and into the 21st century. But here, let's take a look at this cookbook by Juan de Altamira's Nuevo Arte de Cocina Española. I would say that this is probably the best known Spanish cookbook of the 18th century. It contains some 220 recipes designed for those with limited resources, unlike Francisco Martínez Montiño's cookbook that was designed for the court. Translator and author Vicky Hayward has published an award-winning edition just 3 years ago. And in this cookbook, Altamira's uses over a dozen of Martínez Montiño's recipes, including his well-known pepitoria, that's like a stew with poultry offal, several baked dishes of costradas, and then in a later edition of Altamira's that came out in 1770, over a dozen recipes of Martínez Montiño were directly added to that for roasts, pies, and empanadas, and different preserved fruits and vegetables. The second example that I wanted to provide is from early 20th century. Writer Emilia Pardo Bazan published 2 cookbooks. The first of the series was on older Spanish recipes. That's this one. And in this work, she includes kind of the quirkier recipes from Martinez Montiño. So one is an egg recipe called huevos de capirote. That's kind of cool because she breaks the egg, or Martinez Montiño breaks the egg in half, takes out the whites and leaves the yolk in, and then in a pan with tons of melted butter, flips that egg yolk over and lets it solidify, takes the yolk off, and then continues to cook the yolk with the melted butter on it. So that comes from Martinez Montiño, as well as black pepper sausage. By the time of Emilia Pardo Bazán, paprika, of course, was big into the sausage, but in Martinez Montiño's recipe, it's black pepper sausages. So she recovers that one. And then also really the only recipe for couscous between Hispano-Muslim era and today was in Martinez Montiño, and she recovers his couscous recipes as well on that. So the third example I want to give are really recipes collections in the New World. And here we have 18th century, 3 examples from 18th century Mexico. In this first one, it's a work that of a manuscript transcribed and edited in late 20th century. It's divided into 3 parts and contains recipes by 23 different people. And in the second section, which consists of about 40 recipes, 20% of the entire manuscript, it is all Martinez Montiño. So you see his influence there in 18th century Mexico. The second example, again, is a recipe collection that's put together later on based on a manuscript by Doña Guzmán. And in here we see Martinez Montiño's gallina morisca recipe, again, word for word. And we just see an example once again of Martinez Montiño being a key figure of keeping Muslim recipes alive for these Christian audiences. Like we saw with Emilio Pardo Bazán and the couscous, and here with Doña Guzmán, these are sort of selected out of his cookbook. The third example I wanted to show here in 18th century Mexico is actually a book on the founding of Santa Fe, and their early governor, Diego de Vargas, in his inventory of the will, had in fact a copy of Martinez Montiño's cookbook. So you get a sense, right, of the aristocracy that's including these works in their own collection. So the question of Martinez Montiño in Mexican kitchens really, for me, begs the question of how widespread his influence was during the rapid expansion of the Spanish Empire around the globe. And I think that there's opportunities here for further studies. The idea of looking into viceroys and other political figures' inventories and opening up studies of how Spanish cuisine entered into the Spanish colonies of the 17th and 18th century, and then just returning back to the peninsula and looking at diplomatic ties in the court of Philip III, who he cooked for, who visited there, and what food exchanges may have occurred, because we certainly see international elements in his own cookbook that he references. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to Marissa Nicosia, and she will be speaking about cooking the recipe book.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Leah and Becky and everyone at the Newbery and the Folger who made this event possible. I'm going to show you some images of English recipe books from the 17th and 18th century to accompany my remarks. Keeping track of what is in season and when and how to consume it is no small feat. Renaissance households filled the pages of receipt books with culinary recipes to save the fruits of the harvest. As Elaine Long writes in Recipes and Everyday Knowledge, men and women solicited recipes from members of their social networks, and stewards, servants, cooks, dairymaids, and gardeners all participated in the labor of growing or procuring ingredients and preparing medicines and meals. Cooks in English households used locally grown ingredients in combination with imported goods, such as spices and sugar, to preserve the bounty of the harvest in jams, pickles, pies, and dried goods. And my points here about sugar and preservation owe debts to Kim Hall and Amy Tigner's work on the topic. Although local ingredients formed the basis of these seasonal recipes, imported goods that came to Europe from colonial holdings or imperial trade routes flavored and acted as crucial preservation agents in these recipes. Ingredients such as sugar cultivated by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean led to cheaper prices and more widespread availability in Europe. While dishes prepared in elite kitchens may have been seasoned with these imported spices and ingredients, expensive both in terms of their price and in the human cost of their production by enslaved or exploited laborers in the West and East Indies, most of what English people ate across the socioeconomic spectrum was grown locally and consumed quickly or preserved for future use. Mrs. Knight's receipt book, which is dated circa 1740 and is now held at the Folger Shakespeare Library, demonstrates how one household kept track of seasonal foods and preserving practices. So in between culinary recipes, this Mrs. Knight or another user lists garden stuff in season for the months of May through December. The May entry on this list enumerates an array of vegetables that are ready to eat, but it also notes that this is the ideal month to distill herbs into tonics and waters for medicinal and culinary uses throughout the year. So for May, asparagus, cauliflowers, cilantro, lettuce, cucumbers, peas, bean, artichokes, scarlet strawberries, kidney beans, distill herbs this month. Likewise, the August entry mentions that cucumbers for pickling are ripe and serves as a reminder that annual pickling of this crop and likely others should commence in earnest. So August with an abbreviation. Cabbages and their sprouts, cauliflower, artichokes, cabbage, lettuce, carrots, potatoes, turnips, some beans, peas and kidney beans, radishes, horseradish, onions, cucumbers for pickling, garlic, melons. Eating seasonally requires culinary creativity. By paying attention to what was growing in the garden, when it was ready to pick, and what might be done with it, the users of recipe books like this one could make the most of their harvest. This manuscript includes many recipes for pickling, drying, candying, potting, and jam making that Knight and other members of her household could use to preserve the stuff from the garden. I promised to speak today about cooking the recipe book because I update recipes from manuscript cookbooks in my ongoing Cooking in the Archives project. But I also know that I've just spent most of my allotted 5 minutes speaking about saving the seasons, how recipe books offer us a window into what was in season when and how Renaissance households may do. There are a few reasons for this, but COVID-19 stay-at-home orders in particular have me thinking about preserving for times of hardship and confinement, as well as the fragilities of our 21st century foodways. So let me leave you with a cooking example. A recipe for strawberry jam that I made this summer from a Clark Library manuscript. This recipe specifically calls for scarlet strawberries, but notes that others will do, but not so well. Mrs. Knight's list notes that scarlet strawberries are ready to harvest in May. And that happens to be the month that I tested this with American strawberries, which in fact may be the imported strain of scarlet strawberries that Knight and the Clark compiler both call for. There's some ambiguity here about strains of strawberry varieties. Due to COVID-19 stay-at-home orders, I ordered my sugar and blackcurrant juice online, which I don't normally do, and purchased strawberries at an open-air farmer's market. The inclusion of blackcurrant juice adds a wonderful depth of flavor to this jam, but I completely botched the first batch I prepared by putting in too much juice and burning the whole jam into fruit leather as I tried to adequately reduce it. It came out much better a second time with less juice. I have infinite respect for the hearth cooks who navigated preparing recipes like this one following instructions. Set it over a charcoal fire and let it boil gently till it jellies. The embodied practice of making the jam, acquiring the ingredients, the failed batch, the successful batch, had me thinking about thrift, recipe writing as technical how-to literature, the sources of ingredients and the ethics of foodways, the connection between the preservative power of sugar and the insurmountable cost of sugar to enslaved laborers in the early modern period, and the risks essential food workers have undertaken daily since March to keep us fed. Cooking these recipes for preserves, again, conducting recipe trials anew, offers us a way to reflect upon the nameless communities that were responsible for making those recipes possible, both in the early modern era and in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Our final presentation will be Amy Tigner, and she will be speaking about A Taste for Cake in 17th Century Recipe Manuscripts.
Presentation today is called A Taste for Cake in 17th Century English Recipe Manuscripts. And I began this study by thinking about a quote from Shakespeare. So it's from Twelfth Night. Sir Toby Belch proclaims to Malvolio, "Dost thou think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale?" And I just, I think we think a lot about, cake, but at the same time, do we really think about what cake means? And so I started thinking about cake recipes in the 17th century as a way to sort of think about the cultural and technological and network changes, and also the networks of people who were exchanging recipes. So the 17th century allows us to see a narrative of England's burgeoning engagement. I don't know if, let's see, I can't really read this. And burgeoning engagement with global exploration, colonization. Sorry, I can't see, I have to get rid of this. How do I get rid of this? There we go. And commerce. And the development of chemistry and technology and the elusive networks of communities of recipe exchange. And in the longer paper, I look at 3 different recipes as we move through the 17th century to think about the kind of changes that are happening and how we can essentially read a recipe to think about cultural issues that are happening in a culture. It's funny that Marissa mentioned this because, of course, I'm going to talk about sugar and slavery. Cake's dependence on imperialism, slavery, and trade is especially significant, given that one of the key ingredients that makes cake and distinguishes it from its predecessor, bread, is, of course, sugar. And I've got a little image there of slaves that are doing all the kinds of labor that's involved in sugar making, though it wouldn't have happened all in one picture. The English and other Europeans, with their insatiable desire for cake and other sweetmeats, fueled the ongoing slave trade that costs so much in human blood. And I can't really go through the statistics, but the amount is really tremendous that goes up in the 17th century from about £1, I'm trying to remember, it's about £1 per person per capita to something like 20 pounds by the end of the century. So, and the English really got into the sugar business in the mid-century, and then they really took off in the 1660s, and we see in the cake recipes a huge increase in the amount of sugar during this period of time. So chemistry and technology also changes. The 17th century saw a divide between the ingredients and the chemical properties in recipes for bread and for cake. The difference in ingredients thus created the need for distinctive technological changes in the kitchen. So early cakes were really much more like what we would think of as kind of fruit cakes or fruit breads. They were sweetened with currants usually, or raisins, and they were leavened with yeast, and they didn't have any kind of container. They were just kind of clunked onto a piece of paper that would be put into the oven and baked. And so because it was more like bread, it didn't really need any kind of container. But As the century goes on, the introduction of eggs comes into recipes. And so what we see with the addition of eggs generally in cake is that the egg protein produces a more tender crumb, the fat from yolk enriches the batter, and the action of the whisking traps air and aids that in the rising. And a lot of these recipes call for like an hour and 15 minutes of whipping the eggs. When I make these recipes, I use a mixer. And I can't imagine doing that, though. Of course, we have to remember that the kitchens were full of people, so probably this is a chore that was passed from one person to another. So the English solution to an eggy cake batter was to use a hoop, which seems really, this hoop here, this is not my photograph. This was something I was able to find. But they're using either tin hoops or sometimes wood or sometimes even paper hoops. We tend to think of, a pan to bake a cake in as being like, yeah, well, that's, of course you're going to do that, but they don't have the English don't have a tradition of that. They have a tradition of baking, for example, pies would be baked in crusts that would be called coffins. So this is actually quite an innovation for them to be baking something in a separate container. And it also changes how they're using paper. So they would have been using paper, as we see here, as a kind of base. These hoops don't have a bottom to them, so they're setting them directly onto the paper. And then sometimes what we get is directions for the paper to become a kind of collar, or in one case, in Constance Hall's 17th century manuscript, she talks about sewing together a very large cake hoop. And these cakes often are huge. One recipe I looked at, the Fetty Place recipe, it calls for a peck of flour. That's about 12 pounds. So it makes an enormous cake. So some of these hoops would be expandable also. This is the pão de ló, which is a recipe that comes from Anne Fanshawe, and it's a Portuguese recipe that she gets. She's the wife of an ambassador to the Iberian Peninsula, and so she has recipes from Spain and from Portugal. Something else that's quite interesting to me in these recipes is how it shows networks. This is a recipe, a seed cake, Mrs. Taverner's Way. This is from the Granville family receipt book, which starts in about 1640 and goes into the 18th century. And it has this provenance of Mrs. Taverner. And if you look at manuscripts, you'll know sometimes they say who they come from and sometimes they don't. But, and sometimes we know they're sort of famous people. They might be aristocrats or doctors, but sometimes they're like Mrs. Taverner. And at least I think she's just a sort of normal person with a good cake recipe. But we can understand that when we see it's this kind of evidence of how the ideas in new cake chemistry and the technology spread through communities of friends, neighbors, and acquaintances as they gave and received recipes, a word itself that derives from the Latin word recipere, to receive. So reading recipes, and I think as this panel attests, and maybe this whole conference attests, allows us to see far beyond the direct culinary outcomes, in my case, cake. And cake tells a complicated story, certainly of the dark side of sugar, but also the brighter side of human ingenuity and communal networks. Thank you.
That concludes the presentation portion. So to kick off the Q&A period so we can really have a good discussion, I'd like to start with a very broad question, and any panelist can jump in here. It's kind of a riff on a question that started off the last session, the public session, and a couple of you have alluded to this or spoke very directly about this. Amy, you did. Carolyn, you spoke to this specifically as well. But what is the importance or significance or relevance of studying cookbooks and recipe books? The relevance of studying these recipes today.
I'm happy to, since you mentioned me, I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit about it. for me, I'm a literary scholar, but what it allows me to do is to think about these works which are written not only by women, but primarily by women and used by women. And they tend to be a kind of, I don't know, a form that's not very well respected as a literary form. But I think that we can be thinking about them as and to be thinking about how small, I like to think about it as the butterfly effect, you know, the idea that the flapping butterfly is going to create a hurricane. But there's a way in which making a cake is creating slavery. And we don't tend to think of eating cake as being something, you know, horrible to do. And I mean, I do it all the time. But at the same time, I think this allows us to be thinking about these larger issues that these very small literary snippets give us this sort of view into the culture. Okay, I'll hand it over to somebody else.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. Like Amy, I too am a literary scholar, and I feel cookbooks and recipes, we study them for really the same reasons we do any humanistic inquiry, right, to understand our past. But cookbooks offer insight into the cultural and social identities of people of the early modern era. So I think looking at these cultural artifacts, thinking about the ingredients, thinking about the flavors, just tells us something about the community and the time period in which they were written. They can highlight regional, ethnic, international cooking practices and tastes. They can they reveal things about identities in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity and religion. And they're ways to understand what was valued at the time period. Additionally, they're prescriptive texts, and they really help to visualize kitchen spaces and kitchen equipment. They describe in detail forms of presentation, dishware that's used, color and shapes and of the arrangements, details to garnishes. The other thing I think that they do is they help us to understand a little bit more who was in the kitchen, right? They provide insight into the life of the master cooks in terms of the courtroom cookbooks, the court cookbooks, and then others who worked in the kitchen as well. And they give a sense to the reader of how cooks think about food. I think in this cookbook, you know, the one that I've been working on, the Martinez Montiño, you really get insights just in the margins of the recipes. It's not about, I mean, of course it's about, you know, what the instructions are, but then there's the side comments about taste, about who he's cooking for, about who's in the kitchen with them. So for all those reasons, I think it's important to study cookbooks.
Can I add one thing? Yeah, I just want to add the historian perspective, since Amy and Caroline are from literary studies, but I think everything is together in when we deal with cookbooks or recipe books, the interdisciplinary work is really necessary. But I think specifically for historians, cookbooks offer a very different perspective to study societies and their particularities, because we are always looking for changes and the specificities, we as historians, and working with the traditional written sources sometimes give us not such a wide or broader perspective to get closer to men and women from the past. So for us, it's really a very rich material to deal with in search of these particularities, specificities.
I think that recipe books also, we are kind of bound to this idea that a recipe is just to cook, and we are just looking into those steps in how to proceed from operation 1 to operation 2, and when to add ingredient 1 and when to add ingredient 7, for example, right? But I think that at least in the text that I've been analyzing, there's so many other aspects of it. There are many aspects. There are a lot of technological information. I mean, just the fact that counting time, of course, that is not done by minutes and seconds, for example, or calculating temperature. Or also, for example, the knowledge that is behind any action that a cook takes. There are several recipes in Maestro Martino where, while he's saying how to cook something, he also says that if you do it in a different way, that preparation will last longer, but you will lose taste on it. By refrying a second time or frying a third time, you will lose taste. Whereas if you fry it only once, you will have the better taste. But frying 3 times, it will enhance the possibility of that specific preparation to keep longer. So I think that there's a lot of things there that looking at culinary recipes also, sometimes it breaks down a little bit some assumptions that we made. Sugar was present in Europe, not to disregard the importance of sugar, of course, with the expansion, the transatlantic expansion, but sugar was there, spices were there. It's just another way of arranging things.
Moving on to another question. One of the people in our audience has raised a question, and I think it's just so timely right now. Marissa, when you were presenting and you were speaking about ruining a batch of the jam that you were preparing, that got this audience member and me thinking about how we can think about recipe practicality and scarcity and waste, especially in times where we can't access all the ingredients that we need, or there is widespread hunger or restrictions to food, physically or financially. So could any of you, Marissa, if you want to start, or anyone else, speak to some of those issues in the cookbooks and recipe books that you're working with?
I'm happy to speak to that, and I was really excited to see that question come up in the chat, in the Q&A chat. And I don't have a good answer for it, but it's something I'm really thinking about. I'm thinking about it in my recipe recreation practices. I'm thinking about it when I'm reading manuscript cookbooks. I'm thinking about it in my own household as I'm trying to make do with what I have. And I guess the thing that I'll say that I see in English manuscript cookbooks is a prevalence for collecting a lot of recipes for what seem to be pretty much the same thing. So whether it's another receipt for plague water because you want to have as many plague cures as you can possibly have in your recipe book, to all sorts of different kinds of apple chips and peach chips that are dried in the oven, and different pickle formulations and different seasonings, and those recipes that you like that you might only use once a year, or you might only use when there is an outbreak of plague. There are so many more of them in the cookbooks, in the recipe manuscripts, than for things like brown bread, which people didn't necessarily need a recipe for because they made it every day because it was part of embodied culinary practice. So it wasn't written down. It wasn't part of the economy of exchange that Amy talked about, where the recipe was a gift from one person to another. So I think that copia, that abundance of recipes for preserving, gets at a real constant thread of scarcity that came up a lot in the public panel before this one, as well as kind of throughout our own.
One of the observations I've had in working with these early modern Spanish cookbooks is that really there's an enormous effort to use everything, right? So I'm constantly reminded of the lack of waste. So all parts of the animal are consumed, for example, and then there's also that class issue that what's not consumed by the elite gets passed down to the next level, and then to the next level. So it's just a nice reminder of the consciousness, I guess, of that notion of waste or lack of waste. It also comes through in some of the recipe books for preserving. A lot of us have talked about that today. Not only fruits through the seasons, but also meat products, salting practices, brining things.
Yeah, I also wanted to actually, David Goldstein writes about this. Hannah Woolley, who is the first woman, English woman to write cookbooks and publish them in mid 17th century, writes about sort of reusing meat products. And her cookbook is interesting because it's not really aimed at it's called the queen-like closet. So it's aimed at a more middling class trying to become as if they were wealthy, but she gives them sort of, tips and tricks about how to do things. If you can't afford this, you can, you can do this. And one of the recipes is sort of, you can, I can't remember it exactly, but you can use this cheaper joint of meat instead, and you can reuse, you can use meat that you hadn't used in this other dish. So there are ways in which the sort of leftover practice is definitely alive in some of the recipe books. I mean, it depends completely. If you're looking at a court book, that's a very different kind of cooking than a kind of a book that's used in a middling class, or even in a state which might be feeding a lot of people, as what Carolyn was talking about, the sort of the passing down of food to the point where eventually the leftovers get sort of handed out the door to beggars or something that might be part of that whole economy, food economy.
In the case of apicius, we do find some recipes regarding the better way to preserve certain kinds of food. We do find some recommendations to use some food as medicine, like 13%, I would say, of the recipes, of the Apician recipes, bears this kind of therapeutical recommendation. But since I don't work with the food stuff or the consumption of these preparations, because I deal with the reading and the consumption, abstract consumption of Apicius in the Renaissance, I don't go further into these details. But thinking Apicius related to the ancient period, or at least that period where the circulation of its recipes might have happened, maybe those recommendations for preserving or for treating people were real ones.
Well, we've had a question that's more historiographical in nature. So if anyone would like to try and take a stab at responding to this. Cookbooks were not studied very much for most of the 20th century before suddenly there was this explosion in interest in using cookbooks and then eventually recipe books as historical sources. Is it only because of the cultural turn, or do you have any other ideas of why people started turning to these cookbooks and recipe books?
I think it's very hard to answer this question. I have really to think, but cultural turns has a lot to do, in my opinion, with this rediscovery of the possibilities of rediscovery of the cookbooks and their possibilities. In thinking about historiography, and especially to study the Middle Ages, this is very clear. We have to wait for the analysis school, sort of, to go to this kind of sources and consider them legitimate for the historians to study society. But maybe there is also something else, and something related to media, to food starting to appear more frequently in the media in general, show TVs. I think mainly thinking about my reality, South America reality, the media, the food TV programs was really very important to call people's attention to the potentialities of this kind of text in order to study societies and culture in general. So we have this interest from the historian's perspective, I mean, this interest coming from the discussion, the historiographical discussion, but we have also this interest coming from the public, the general public.
I might also add, I agree a lot. I do agree with what Vanessa is saying in terms of exposure to food, but I also think that in the 70s, that huge shift, right, like just the postmodern era has allowed us to open up and think about history that, like I think of Hayden White's article, right, on that capital H, that, and truth, that we need to access other sources and other approaches. And so food being one, so universal, two, so intimate, three, so prevalent in everyone's life, it seems to me like an obvious way to explore the past. So it seems like a natural progression. I think that the food shows actually kind of come out of that shift of approach to understanding the world.
And following a little bit of what Carolyn has been said, I think that there's also at least there's also a connection between the abundance that we think we have about food nowadays and the accessibility of food that we have nowadays. I mean, there's always this question, right? Why we almost never have a written testimonial of the kitchen of poor people, right? Or it's way harder to find out. It's only in the moment in which food is abundant that there is also the necessity, historically speaking, the necessity to record it, right? It always come out from moments of where food is either in the Renaissance courts where food is used just to assert power, right? But food is kind of an accessory. So I think that also, as Carolyn says, with the 70s, 60s, and 70s, with the fact that food has become a commodity, right? And we have a way easier access to different food items. There's also some sort of a going back to the recorded history of how to prepare food that might be at play. There was also, I think that is, there's always this big problem with cookbooks, right? How much cookbooks do reflect actual cooking, or is it more a wishful thinking about how we eat and how we, which is kind of an interesting problem, right? Which is also have to do with cooking shows nowadays. How much that is actually we as TV users, we use that for learning, for developing skill, or is it just to kind of a guilty pleasure of sitting back and eating some snack while we're looking at this wonderful food to be made? And then this is also true for for culinary recipe collection being produced. How many people, looking at my period of time, by 16th century Italy, how many people do actually bought those cookbooks? Of course, if they were sold, they were also bought, right? But how much that was kind of a real connection with the real world? It's an open question that I leave there.
I think we can go over time just a tiny bit because we don't have any panels following this. So we'll take another couple of questions. We had another question from the audience that I think a lot of you will be able to respond to in very different ways depending on the text you're dealing with. Were the people writing the cookbooks actually experienced cooks? Or were they primarily editors and writers? Was there any sense of ownership, like copyright over specific recipes or techniques?
I'm happy to speak to that for the manuscript recipe context. And I work entirely in the English context and mostly in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I see in those books the social networks of a community, much like Amy was talking about when she was talking about recipe being related to receiving a receipt, with lots of names of social connections and local connections. I've also been doing work on how printed recipes from published cookbooks like Hannah Woolley's cookbooks get copied into recipe manuscripts. So there, Hannah Woolley might be an authority that the compiler of the manuscript recipe cookbook is working from, but that person might not be the authority. And all of this is resting on skilled hearth cooks who are staffing the kitchens of these middling to upper class households, whether it's one servant helping out with the cooking or it's a whole shop of people working together in the kitchen, who are doing the real adjusting with seasoning. The comment about adding salt, I think any cook would do that their own way, and they'd also interpret the instructions to have a soft fire to their own understanding of how fire worked on the hearth. And the people who were compiling the recipe manuscripts were always working in conversation with others, be those others the people who were doing the cooking, and they may have been involved in doing some of it, but other people were whisking those eggs for an hour, not the lady of the household, and also the communities through which they acquired and got their access to recipes, whether that was through letters, through oral transmission, or through copying and borrowing of cookbooks.
I would say that for the 15th, 16th century Italy, there's a big shift between chefs, cooks that were actually writing. We have Maestro Martino, Messisburgo, Scappi, but then there's kind of some sort of a shift, and we're talking about core culture here. We're not talking about normal people, let's say, which is the shift between the cook and the house master, the so-called scalco, right? The master of ceremonies, the one who would organize the entire court in order to prepare a banquet. And that was a task that implied purchasing, directing the cooks, table service, table decorations, music and spectacle and shows during these banquets. So it's there's kind of this shift in authorship. Maestro Martino is the first cookbook that is actually in which the name of the author of the cookbook is actually mentioned, the compiler of the recipe, whatever. There is one interesting thing about Maestro Martino, which is, again, the base for Platina's recipes and also the base for the Palladio's recipes, that most of his recipes are not even, how should I say it? There's so many alternative ingredients that one can use that it's almost not so categorical. It's really hard to find you have to do this and you have to use this ingredient and you have this. But there's this modularity that I mentioned during my presentation. It's really something fascinating. So going back to authorship, I think that it's also for the basic nature of a culinary recipe, right? It's more something that is handed down. That is, as Marissa was saying, right? That is part of an entire network of contacts, of ideas, of shared knowledge.
I think the question also goes to book publication in general. I know the practices in Spain for the first release in 1611, it was over a year process and 3 different levels of sort of scrutiny through the court that the cookbook had to go through before it was published. And when it was released and they set the price, you know, it was per folio, the price per folio. And so it was like 164 maravedis was what it cost when it came out. There was a certain percentage of that would go to whoever had the copyright. And I'm pretty sure that in the first one, Martinez Montino was part of that. There was also the sort of book seller, and then a third party like the book backer. and they would have percentages of that too. But stipulated in that was a 10-year privilege, and no one, in theory, was allowed to copy that without the express permission of one of these three, either the author or the book publisher, the book seller, or the book backer. So I find that interesting. I don't think that held up very well, because you see a lot of stolen and recreated impressions of the different recipes, but that was the idea behind it.
Just to talk a little bit about the period prior to the one Lino mentioned, we don't know much cookbooks from prior to the 12th century, but we do have recipe books inserted in medical texts. We know very little about them, and we are talking about a period of like 1,000 years. And so what I have to say is that I want to call the attention of the importance to know better this huge period of silence in historiography, but not in the documentation. We do have things to study there. We have these recipe books that maybe are culinary, maybe are dietetic, maybe are a mix of that, of the two things, but we still have to study them. So because they are all anonymous, we have very few information to design a profile of these people who wrote recipe or cookbooks in the Middle Ages before the 12th century. So it's interesting how we don't know much about it yet.
I think I'm going to pose just one more question, because we have a couple very similar questions from audience members, and this will be the last one. In the cookbooks and recipes that you're dealing with, could you talk a bit about any exotic foods that appear or post-Columbian exchange indigenous foodstuffs that start appearing in European recipe books? And also, what kinds of things were being viewed as exotic in recipes, and how were they being assimilated over time?
I can speak to this with rice. So we don't tend to think about rice as a particularly exotic ingredient. It's a really important foodstuff globally, but rice really picks up in English recipe books from the mid-17th century through the 18th century as a very popular ingredient. And that's because rice, either strains that were brought by enslaved Africans or were selected for cultivation in consultation with enslaved Africans, were being grown in the Carolinas in the Americas and being shipped over to England in greater volume. So once the Carolina Rice Kitchen took off, again at great human cost to the enslaved laborers who were working in these wet rice fields, rice becomes a exotic and desirable food on the British table. So that's not a New World food being transformed, but that is a moment of transformation in what a particular ingredient meant culturally and who had access to it.
So on a couple of different levels, it's been interesting to me looking at the exchange between Spain and the New World. The cookbooks that I found, all of them, and there's not that many, but all of them in the 16th and 17th century don't really attend to New World products. It's not that they're not there. They're certainly there, because you see them in works of art, you see them on the stage, mentioned in the plays, they're in poetry, they're in novel, I mean, they're everywhere except the cookbooks. But in the case of Martinez Montiño in 1611, it's curious, the one that he mentions is turkey, and it's the opening recipe. So it definitely has a privileged space. And then it comes up a couple times throughout the recipe. He has in his prologue a mention to potatoes, but there are no recipes. The potatoes don't show up in the recipe book. And it's not really in cookbooks, it's a slower entry. So you don't see the prevalence of tomatoes and potatoes until really the mid 18th century. They start showing up in the cookbooks. Chocolate is pretty different. Chocolate comes in hard and fast. It comes in through elite circles, and there are rapidly treatises on chocolate, debates, on the morality of chocolate. So that sort of has a different trajectory than, say, potatoes or tomatoes and other products coming in from the New World. But they're there for sure because, like I said, looking at other manifestations of textual and visual manifestations, they're in Spain. So.
Well, thank you. Oh, Amy, yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, Carolyn mentioned chocolate, and chocolate's one of my favorite things to talk about and eat. But I think chocolate in the British context is interesting because it does come through Spain and through Portugal. And so we do get, it's definitely mid 17th century and later, we start seeing recipes in manuscripts. And then early cookbooks. So again, mid-century cookbooks. So Hannah Woolley has a couple of chocolate recipes, and chocolate at this point is not something you eat, but something you drink. And there are almost immediately changes that are made to chocolate. It's a cold and bitter drink for the New World. It becomes hot and sweet. And, they start adding things like milk and wine, which sounds kind of good to me. I guess we have chocolate wine. But there are ways in which I think chocolate, I think Carolyn's absolutely right, that chocolate is something that it's clearly an elite food. And then it starts entering chocolate houses and coffee houses. So it becomes something that's that has cachet for the people who can afford it, and it is very expensive. And so I think that's part of it as well.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all to all the panelists. Thank you for everyone in the audience. There are a lot of questions that we were not able to get to, so we are going to be distributing those in writing to all the panelists, and maybe if you're really lucky, you might get a written response at some point on those. But thank you all for participating and attending today.
Hey, Sarah, when you share those questions, will we have access to people's emails to be able to respond to them?
Oh, that's a good question for people behind the scenes. Does anyone want to type a response? Yes, in some cases, but maybe not, but sometimes yes. So some people who are very lucky and we know who you are, you might actually get a response, and we'll do the best that we can in getting responses to you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you all.
Yes, Sarah.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Very interesting panel.
Thank you.